I have an Olympus H-Zuiko Auto W 24mm 2.8 lens here that I'm going to be fully disassembling. This lens is almost identical in its external appearance and its internal construction with the 28mm, which is also quite similar with the 50mm Olympuses. So I have the 28mm 3.5 here, and you can see externally they're quite similar. The 24 is just a hair taller, and it's a bit heavier as well. But internally and externally, they're very similar. It's an easy lens to take apart. With just a few steps, you can get access to the diaphragm, and you can also really disassemble the optics and clean them pretty well, and actually clean inside the various optical pieces. So if there's fungus or dust inside, it's easy enough to actually service the lens and repair that. I'm going to be fully disassembling this lens to get access to the diaphragm, optics, and mechanical sections on their own. Starting off, we'll go in from the front of the lens and get access to the diaphragm that way. This one is one of the lenses that is best to disassemble from the front. So looking here at the front, you can see that there's the name ring going around on the exterior here, but there are no divots or anything for a spanning wrench. So what you have to do to actually loosen this up is with a piece of pipe or something like that that can fit onto the name ring. Take some gaffer's tape, apply that around the pipe, and that gives you enough of a grip to actually undo the name ring, or at least get it started. So I'll undo the name ring here, and the name ring is actually what is holding everything in place. So once I take off the name ring, I can take off this next metal black ring as well because it was holding that on. So that's what the filters are screwing into. There's this ring right below it, right here, the silver one. This is actually what is causing the clicking sound. So I'll lift this up. As you turn the aperture control, it's at the top of the lens, unlike many other lenses. And there's a small ball bearing right here as well, which is what was causing the clicking sound. So we'll just remove that. And then finally, we have one more piece that we can remove that was also loosened up, and that's the aperture control ring itself, which was just sitting right below there. So this entire black ring can take that off. So now we've exposed the top of the focusing ring down here, and then also the inner first optical piece as well, and the entire diaphragm enclosure in here. So as a next step, we'll go in and get access to the front of the diaphragm. So looking in at this top section here on the outside of the glass, you can see that there's two little divots down here for a pointed tip spanning wrench. You can also use a screwdriver on this, but we're going to loosen up this section right here, which will remove the entire front glass element. Alright, so there's the entire front group there. And we'll return and take a look at some of the disassembling of some of the optics a little bit later. And now we've exposed the front of the diaphragm here. So if I hit the levers on the outside of the lens to actually stop it down, you can see that the front of the diaphragm is exposed. So that can be cleaned off on its own. One downside of this lens, though, is that the mechanical sections and the diaphragm are very integrated. You can see all the coupling from the aperture control ring is happening here on the top of the diaphragm. So it's a very compact design, but it makes it a little bit harder to repair because you have all this stuff in front of the diaphragm. So to actually disassemble the diaphragm and clean the blades on their own is much harder because you have to go through all this other stuff. So that's not actually something I'm going to be doing on this disassembly. The entire process, though, is almost identical to the 28mm or the 50mm lens, where you can just remove the various elements going in here, and then you have the diaphragm on its own. So now flipping over the lens, looking at the back side here, we have the mounting plate, the silver section going around here with 3 screws. So we'll undo these 3 to remove the entire mounting plate. Now we can just lift off the entire mounting plate assembly here. And this also has some of the mechanical couplings that are going through to the front of the lens where all the mechanical control of the diaphragm is happening. So I'll talk more about this on the reassembly, but you can see all the various springs and things here. And some of these can become misaligned, or there can be friction in here, which I'll talk about on the reassembly. So now we have the back of the lens, the back glass element in here, and the back of the diaphragm assembly. So just going to remove the first back glass element here, which is this kind of gray colored ring going around on the top of this section here. It just unscrews in place. Remove the back protective glass element there. And now we'll actually remove the entire diaphragm assembly from the focusing mechanism. And what is holding it in place are the 3 screws in the silver section going around here. So there's one here, and one here. They have little washers on the other side as well, but we'll undo these 3. And then the diaphragm itself with the remaining back glass pieces will just fall out of place. And we'll have the focusing mechanism on its own as well. Alright, so now just pushing this back. And these little brass colored things, those are the washers I was talking about before. There's one for each of the screws we just removed. So now we have the aperture or the focusing mechanism here, the focusing ring, and the diaphragm assembly itself with all the couplings that actually control the aperture. So I think you can leave on that back glass piece that I removed before at this stage as well, and then remove it later. But looking at the diaphragm assembly here, we have 2 levers on it. Let me see. So there's this silver one over here, which is moving the top section around. And then there's this one on the bottom, which actually directly opens and closes the diaphragm. The silver one is the aperture control lever that was being hooked in at the top of the lens. The one down here is being hooked in so that the diaphragm only closes when the camera is actually mounted. Looking back at the back of the diaphragm here, at the back glass piece where we removed the top before, there's a little bit recessed down. You can see 4 little spots for a spanning wrench, a pointed tip spanning wrench. These are pretty small, so you might have to use a screwdriver on them to actually get these. But we can remove the entire back glass element and get access to the back of the diaphragm this way. Alright, so just remove that last little glass piece there. And now we have access to the back of the diaphragm as well. As I mentioned, you can actually get access to the diaphragm. It just is a more involved process than on other lenses because you have all these mechanical pieces sitting in front of it. So you just have to remove, going in from the front, you would remove this little bar over to the side first, then the top section, and then all the individual little mechanical coupling pieces on top of it, and then you'd have the diaphragm on its own. It's very similar to the 28mm though, almost exactly the same setup. The only real difference in this lens is the optics. Now we can take a look at the big front optical piece here. As I mentioned, one nice thing about this lens is that you can actually disassemble many of these optical pieces, so if there's fungus or dust or other things inside of the lens, not just on the front or back surfaces here, you can actually go in and try to repair those. It's usually not best to do this unless you really need to, like there is actually fungus inside, or there is dust that you want to try to remove because you'll usually just mess things up more. So looking at the front optic, since the back optic is pretty much fully disassembled, on the back one, there is on this, the piece that was next to the diaphragm directly, or the one that was actually on the back of the lens exposed, you can see that there are 2 sections here. There's the gray section and then the back black section on the back here. And I think you can unscrew these. There might be some adhesive on this as well, but I haven't been able to. It's very difficult to actually grip this and then unscrew it successfully because the piece is so small. It does have little divots for a spanning wrench, but still I haven't been able to undo these pieces. The front piece though is a little bit larger, so it is easier to undo. I have to be careful not to set it down directly. I think that you can risk scratching the front element if you set it directly on a surface at this point. So looking at the back section here, we have 2 divots for a spanning wrench, little holes for a spanning wrench, pointed tip one on either side here. And this is going to remove the back half of this, the part that's sticking out from the front section, which is kind of the pancake shaped section in here. And now we have this back section here, and it's much like on the back of the lens here, where you have a cap section, which is the more grayish colored section that can be unscrewed. And this little cap is just holding things in place. And then using this, I'm going to use a Q-tip here. So looking at the lens this way, if I press on this side over here with a Q-tip, you can pop out the entire lens groups here. So there are 3 little sections here. You can see that the one that was going in towards this side of the lens, in the larger section of the lens, is slightly smaller, and then the larger section was the one that the cap was going on. So you can actually clean these. You can't disassemble this piece any further though. So this is as far as you can disassemble this one. And in the pancake shaped section here, now looking at the back side of that again, See, there's another divots or set of divots for the spanning wrench here and here, which I have not been able to remove successfully, but I believe you can. Again, there seems to be some sort of adhesive going around in this section that's actually keeping this locked in place, so it's pretty tightly screwed in there. So I can try, but I don't think I'll be able to remove this. Yeah, so that's pretty tightly in there. But using that, I believe you should be able to further disassemble the lens, and you could try to dissolve the adhesive with some isopropyl alcohol. But what I know you can remove is the intersection here, the black ring. So that one has two slots for a spanning wrench, so using a regular flat tip spanning wrench here, you can use the two slots right here to actually undo the black ring. Okay, so that black ring was just holding things in place, and then it was holding this one back glass piece in place, which you can just pop out of place now. There we go. So there's that one, and then you can clean the back section here as well. Again, I think you can further disassemble this one both by removing this kind of silver back plate here with a spanning wrench and dissolving the adhesive, and by also unscrewing the top more grayish colored section on the front of the lens here. I just have not been able to do that successfully. So at this stage, you have the lens as fully disassembled as I'm going to be taking it. There are pieces in here that can be further taken apart, but to really just do simple repairs on the lens, such as cleaning the diaphragm, this is really, or cleaning the optics, which is the most common case, or even making mechanical repairs, this is all you need to do. So we have the aperture, which has all the mechanical couplings, and then the diaphragm itself in here, separate from the mounting plate, which has the couplings for the back of the lens. And that's separate from all the different various optics and things. And you can see it's not a very complex lens, especially if you skip taking apart the optics, because if there aren't any problems with them, which is what I would recommend that you do. So if you skip taking apart the optics, there's really not too much that you have to take apart to disassemble this lens and be able to repair it pretty well. So starting on the reassembly here, we'll start by putting together the optics again. So grab the pancake-shaped front element, the largest one. We're going to start with the little glass piece here that went in first and was held in place by the black cap. So we want the convex side, the one sticking out, going down into the lens at this stage. And I will say that putting the optics back together is a bit difficult because they don't have a lot to grip onto, so it's very easy to get fingerprints and and get dust and other things and actually make things worse than when you took them apart originally, which is why I'd recommend not disassembling them in the first place. So we'll slip the convex side down into the lens here, and just push it into place, make sure it's flat. Okay, and then grab the little black ring that went on top of it and get that started. Okay, next up we'll get the second part of the front optic in place. So we have the metal ring here, the cap, and then the 3-section glass piece in here. And as I pointed out before, this glass piece has two sides. This side over here, which is slightly smaller than the side over here. So the side on this side that's larger is the one that actually goes into the cap like that. And the cap goes on to the back section of here. So slide this in from the back side here. Get this reversed. So slide it in with the smaller section first. Make sure it's sitting flush down there, and then screw on the black cap. And now the two front optic pieces just screw together. And we can fully lock it down using a pointed tip spanning wrench in the two little holes on the back of the front optic piece. Alright, so that has that all reassembled. You can also reassemble the lens in a slightly different order here that should be a little easier. So grabbing the diaphragm and the mechanical sections, you can put the front optic back in place first. So it just screws into the diaphragm assembly here. And we can lock that down with the two little holes for a spanning wrench. And now looking at the back side of this diaphragm assembly, we have to reinstall the back optic as well. So the first component of the back optic that we have to install is this the pancake-shaped piece here. It has one side that has four divots for a pointed tip spanning wrench. That's the side that's going to face backwards towards us. So this just screws into the back of the diaphragm. There's a spanning wrench to lock that down as well. And to complete the optical reassembly of the lens here, just screw in this last back section here, the one with the grayish top section going outwards, and it just screws into the back section of the diaphragm. Alright, so now we have the entire diaphragm mechanism and lens optically all reassembled here. This is also a good point to look at how the lens operates and how things are getting coupled into the diaphragm. So we saw before that on the diaphragm mechanism there are the two levers. The silver one, which is controlling the aperture, or it's controlled by the aperture control ring, and when you move this one back and forth on its own, you see that nothing is actually happening. And then there's this lever on the back, which when we move it back and forth, if I set the aperture, as I hold the aperture control ring and move that one back and forth while depressing this black lever over here, you can see that now the aperture is moving back and forth. So the aperture only moves when this little black lever is pressed over to this side, and it's automatically held open by a spring in its normal state. So now looking at the mounting plate here to see how things are going to couple in on the back section here, we have the way the mounting plate works is that normally the lens will only depress and the aperture will only move when it's mounted on a camera. So let me grab a camera mount here, or camera mount adapter. So I'm going to simulate mounting this on a camera. And you can see that as I mount this and I rotate this to actually complete the mounting onto a camera, this little silver post on the back section is going to slide over. And that's actually what is going to directly control. It's going to hit the black little post over here and hold that open. On the mount as well, there's this other little bar up here, the one that moves freely back and forth. And that one's indicating where the aperture is currently set. That one goes right next to the post on the black post on the back section of the aperture here. It goes into this little silver section down here. And the silver section is hooked directly into the same control as the aperture control ring. So as I move the aperture control ring back and forth up here, that little silver section moves back and forth. So that's the indicator of where the aperture is currently set. So that's how everything's going to couple back together in a moment. But first off, we have to get the diaphragm mechanism back here inside of the focusing mechanism. So we have the focusing mechanism here, and we want to find the orientation where the black lever on the back section here is going through the gap in the focusing mechanism on the back. So like this. And we also have to get the three little washers in place for this. So this can be a little bit annoying, but we have to get the three brass washers in front of each of these screw holes going around on the back of the mounting plate. So for each one, I'll just line it up with where the screw is going to go. And it helps a little that these are a bit oily because it helps them stay in place a slight amount. And now I'll lower the lens back in place with the black lever going through the gap on that side. Okay, and then we can reattach these using the three black screws going into those washers and then screwing into the diaphragm itself. So now we have the focusing mechanism back in place. You can see that the black bar is still sticking out through the back section over here. So we're going to grab the mounting plate and line up the black bar so that it goes in front of the silver bar right here, and so that the black bar on the mounting plate goes into the little silver fork back here in the diaphragm. So you're going to line those up. So make sure it's all flush. And you can test and see that everything's coupled together by setting the aperture control ring, this little lever at the top here, to something other than being on the far side over here, and then hitting the two little silver levers on the back section here. And it should stop down the aperture. So now we'll complete reassembling the mounting plate with the 3 screws going around here to reattach it fully. Now I have the entire back of the lens reassembled. And now all that remains is to reinstall all the various front elements. So looking at the front, everything is just going to stack in place, and then the name ring is going to lock everything down. So first up on the front section here, we have the aperture control ring, which is just going to sit down on the lens with the numbers over here, close to where the indicator is for the focus. And the little silver bar, which is controlled by the aperture control ring, is going to go into the hole right here on the back of the aperture control ring. So I'll just get this in place. It should move freely back and forth. And if you stop down the bottom section here or have it mounted on a camera, you should see that the aperture is opening and closing there. Next up is the ball bearing, which is going to go in the smaller of the 2 holes in the aperture control ring. So it just sits in place. And then to actually make the clicking sound as the aperture control ring turns back and forth, there's this silver ring. And this silver ring remains in place while the aperture control ring turns. And it has these little cutouts over here, which is what makes the clicking sound and locks it at specific apertures. So on this silver ring, there's a little notch right over here. You can kind of see it. And on the black inner part of the thing here, on the right next to where the optic is, there's also a little cutout. Those two lock together so that the silver ring remains in place. And the ball bearing should be under the grooves on that side. And the next ring, which is the black ring here, has another little cutout as well because it also doesn't rotate. It's the one that the filters screw into. So it also just goes into that little cutout as well. And all this is locked down by the name ring, which just then screws into the black ring in the front section there. Alright, so that has the reassembly of the lens complete. You can make sure that everything is working as expected, that you can focus through the entire range here, that when the aperture control ring is turned and the lens is not mounted on a camera, that nothing happens, it remains fully open. But then when you mount it on a camera or simulate that the aperture control ring then works properly. Or when you hit the 2 levers, silver levers on the back section here, you can also control the aperture. So overall, this lens is very easy to take apart and pretty repairable. I know that I skipped some of the disassembly steps, but this is really all that you need to do for most normal disassemblies. This allows you to get in and repair the optics and also repair the diaphragm and mechanical sections if you need to. This lens is almost identical in its construction to the 28mm and the 50mm Zuikos that I've taken a look at. They're very similar internally, externally they're also very similar. The only difference is the optics, and you can take apart the optics and clean inside them, but that's not necessary unless there actually is a serious problem with the optics. Usually you're better off just skipping that entirely because you're almost certain to make it worse than how things were originally. So overall, it's a nice, easy to repair lens.